to have technology that is designed with the values of interconnectedness, the values of interbeing, the values of coexistence, co-creating life on Earth, regeneration, all the things that have become a buzzword for what we mean when we're trying to imagine a future with flourishing humanity, is actually what indigenous communities have been experiencing throughout.
Welcome back to the Inner Green Deal podcast with me, Tamsin Walker. It's been a little while, but we do have one final episode to wrap up this season that's been focusing on the role of inner development in the work of NGOs and impact organizations. Throughout, we've been asking how exploring what's going on inside might help to stay grounded in times of turmoil and polarity. And one topic that certainly divides opinion is artificial intelligence. To get into that, I'm joined by Wakanyi Hoffman. She's co-director of the Inclusive AI Lab at Utrecht University, where she's researching ways of integrating indigenous African knowledge into emerging AI systems. She's also a storyteller, educator, and public speaker. So welcome, Wakanyi. It's great to have the chance to talk with you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to dive in, and AI is the topic today. And your work brings AI, indigenous knowledge, storytelling, values all together, which might not be an obvious combination. Can you just tell me a little bit about your journey and how you brought all of these things together to get to where you are now, but also how inner development has perhaps shaped the way that you think about technology?
Yeah, I'll start from the beginning. So I grew up in Kenya, in a part of Nairobi that's on the edge of the city, next to a really big forest called the Ngong Forest, which is one of the oldest forests in Kenya. So very diverse ecologically, more than like 300 bird species and all kinds of animals. And my little primary school was inside the forest. So for me growing up, my introduction to life on Earth was through this very natural ecosystem with a river and a dam that we used to swim in, So I didn't know any different. And then fast forward to college, I did journalism. And then I got married and my husband was working for the UN. So we moved a lot to different countries. And when we had kids, I started to get children's books, read them stories. And I realized that the stories that I was growing up with, or even the lifestyle that my children were experiencing, was vastly different from anything that I had ever experienced. So it just began as a mom, trying to find a way to stay true to the nature of nature. The way that I know how to be human is to be very much part of everything that is alive. And I didn't even think for a minute that that was not the norm for anyone else on the planet, despite living in different parts of the world. So for me, just having children sort of consciously opened up my eyes to the world in which I was going to be raising my kids, that was going to be less natural, more superficial, more materialistic. In fact, that was the thing that I was really concerned about. And the lack of spaces to be with the birds and the trees and all these other things. So I started to write stories that I grew up with to tell my kids. And then I realized that there wasn't enough children's books written by Africans about Africa. So my experience was also invisible to the world. Even now, as I talk about it, I almost feel like it isn't believable to a person unless I take them home and show them exactly where I grew up. And then it comes alive. Because even for Kenyan kids, that's also not the norm, really, to grow up in such a natural environment. So wrote a couple of stories and then turned them into children's books. So it began as that quest for recovering African indigenous knowledge and putting it in some kind of documentation and then passing it forward to my kids. And then from that, I developed a project called the African Folktales Project, a space that African indigenous knowledge can find its place in the future.
Were you living in an urban environment then?
So I was living in Thailand, right outside of Bangkok, and being there, I sort of just realized that there was no way I was going to keep telling my children fairy tales about, good old Africa in the bush and that sort of thing. So I decided to start writing the stories. And then from that, I can kind of plant the seeds in them so that every time we go back, we just have more of a little bit of what they've already experienced through storytelling. And really, that's how the project developed. We ended up moving back to Kenya, so that was really helpful, and the kids really loved it. But now, fast forward to AI, I was actually still very much doing my work in the African Folktales project when I got invited to become a fellow at an institute in Hamburg. And our theme was conceptions of human flourishing. What are other ways of flourishing that are not dedicated towards the material conditions? So how can we think about flourishing without thinking of what is external? So very much digging into the inner world. Of course, for me, this was quite a natural thing, like I've grown up in a forest. I know what that means to be in relationship with everything that's alive. So I was bringing the African Folktales Project into that question of human flourishing. And during that time, the whole topic of AI started to become public. And the question of what does it mean to be human started to become a very philosophical question everywhere that I was going. In fact, in the beginning, it was a bit of an irritation for me. What does it mean to be human? I could not believe we were wrestling with this with this question. I'm like, to be human is to be all, to be everything, to be in everything, to have everything be a reflection of who you are. And I couldn't find the language for it until I remembered the word Ubuntu. It was like, there's that word. We have the word for what it means to be human.
For many people, that would be a new word. Maybe you could explain Ubuntu as a point of reference as we go on through the conversation.
Right. So Ubuntu is a word that comes from the Bantu-speaking communities, and it is from Southern Africa. So it's spoken by the Zulu, the Shona. Different languages have the word Ubuntu. For us, in my mother tongue, which is Kikuyu from Kenya, it's the same word, but it's umundu. So we have the same exact word that is sitting in our minds that directly translates to being human. It's a code for conditions for flourishing, for being human. And so the word itself usually is captured in this saying, umuntu, gumuntu, gabantu, which means a person is a person through other persons. Oftentimes you'll have in popular culture, I am because of who we are. So that's another way of referencing Ubuntu. It's not like people around me when growing up were constantly saying umundu or Ubuntu, right? But it was there. You could see it in how we lived together. When we say it takes a village to raise a child, I am that child that was born in an Ubuntu village where the aunties and the uncles and the cousins and the neighbors were all part of the village that took care of the children. And so Ubuntu to me was the response to what does it mean to be human when we are facing this new intelligence that we've created, an extension of our idea of what it means to be human. And yet, when I look at AI and the data that has been used to train it, it's not coming from the culture that I grew up in, where we have the word Ubuntu, where we have the idea of what it means to be human. So I felt almost like a sense of duty for the future generations that somehow I need to bring this concept of Ubuntu into the space where people are discussing AI ethics and put that question, what does it mean to be human? What are the ethical considerations for designing something that human beings will look at and say, that's a reflection of who we are?
Okay, there is an awful lot for us to dig into there. And I'm getting a sense of real community, like closely woven community, people who support one another and grow together. And all of that, it just sounds like so far away from this more kind of machine-based clinical vision of AI being presented to the world. This kind of, the super intelligence has the potential to wipe mankind, womankind, civilizations right off the planet, or other kind of very dire scenarios that I think are probably quite frightening for a lot of people. So I'm just wondering how you set about making what is inherent in Ubuntu. How do you bring that into this kind of colder, more machine-based narrative that goes with AI?
I start with the question, who do we want to be in the future? What kind of human beings, what kind of culture are we building? And I really root it in the future generations. And this is a very indigenous way of thinking, right? We're designing a world for the next 7 generations. But when we talk about the next 7 generations, we're not talking about children that are not yet here, like the future. We start with a generation of kids in my house. I have children myself. So that's part of the next generation. What kind of adults are they going to be in the future? These kids are the ones who are going to be looking after us. They are the future doctors. They're the future everything, you know? And the Harvard anthropologist Joseph Henrich wrote this book, The Weirdest People in the World, the weird norms. And I love that capturing of what is presumably normative that has also influenced the AI design, right? That's coming out of predominantly Western parts of the world and influencing how everyone else has to sort of be pigeonholed into these normative ideas of humanity when we are so diverse. We have so many ways of being. We have so many ways of seeing. And indigenous knowledge systems are not ancient technology. They're not ancient knowledge systems. They are the knowledge that has influenced our way of being up until now. So what does it mean to have technology that is designed with the values of interconnectedness, the values of interbeing, the values of coexistence, co-creating life on Earth, regeneration, all the things that have become a buzzword for what we mean when we're trying to imagine a future with flourishing humanity, is actually what indigenous communities have been experiencing throughout. So in some ways, it's almost as if we're going back to the past in order to move to the future. And I love that space of trying to recover what we have forgotten, because we can all trace our indigenous roots. We can all trace that original tree of life, right? Back to the beginning. And so if that's what we're trying to attempt to go back to, I feel like the word Ubuntu or African indigenous knowledge systems have so much to teach right now in this pivotal moment when we are looking at something new and different and perhaps scary even. We have a way. There is a blueprint for how to go into community, for how to be in connection with nature. And it isn't just an African idea, but it's very much still active in Africa. And if we can look at that, then we can all start to remember, oh, I remember my grandmother doing this. I remember us being able to walk in the snow and not worry about that. How we get frustrated with the weather is not really a natural reaction to our natural environment. So I want to bring that conversation into that space where we're talking about a technology that mirrors our humanity, and yet our reactions to our natural environment is so unnatural. So what is this machine? What is this AI system really reading about us? And so the potential for us to regenerate and recreate life on Earth really lies on our ability to reclaim our humanity.
It might seem that it's not very logical that AI can teach us something about ourselves that we're no longer really aware of. But what you seem to be saying is that in actual fact, by asking the right question, because you're forced to ask those kinds of questions in a world that's becoming more about artificial intelligence, we have the opportunity to go back and to learn a little bit more about ourselves, to understand what it is to be human, or what different ways we can show up as human beings. But so just like on a practical level, who are you taking these kinds of questions to? Is it people who are designing AI?
I find myself transversing different circles. So I'm in circles with philosophers, and I am part of a lab called the Inclusive AI Lab at Utrecht University. And we host a series of workshops where we actually do hands-on activities around this very question of what it means to be human. So from an Ubuntu perspective, I might hold an Ubuntu workshop. So we'll host a dialogue, a circle of discussions, and then see what we come up with. Normally, we will have people coming from different parts of the world, so different cultures. So our view of the world and our ideas of what it means to be human might seem very different. I've held a circle with indigenous wisdom keepers, academics, and technologists all in the same room. And in the end, we all came up with the same manifesto, more or less looking at humanity as this sort of shared experience that is relational, that we can all even have almost the same stories of origins. So the people that I'm trying to reach actually are AI designers because they've been criticized a lot. And in a way, it's as if we expect them to be on morally higher ground. But I think the bigger question we have to ask ourselves is how this technology became our default, why we need these technologies. What is it about us as human beings that we're trying to resolve within ourselves? And so, as a tech designer, my question is, what is the thought process behind the technology that you're producing? How do you envision this particular tool, whatever it is, an AI designed tool, how is it really going to help us repair that relational field? Because we have a crisis of relationships as human beings. We're so disconnected from our natural environment. And so for me, that disconnection is what I believe technology can help us resolve, if that's what we're building the technologies for. But if the technology is going to further remove us from our own natural setting, then I question the human behind the technology, that human in the loop. So for me, it's more of a design ethic. So Ubuntu becomes a design ethic of what it means to be human and which humans are you creating these technologies for? Can you put yourself in the shoes of the end user? How's that going to help them really reconnect with themselves, reconnect with the planet, reconnect with others around them, their neighbors, their children, reconnect with nature? And if that's not what we're using these technologies for, then it's a huge concern of mine. Hence the question, what kind of human beings do we want to become in the future?
Okay, so that's sort of the underpinning, this inherent ancient wisdom that should be built into these systems. And one concern that I have heard come up over and over again is this idea that if humans are the ones, and this goes to what you just said there, but if humans are programming, designing these systems and teaching the systems, then at some point it potentially ends up kind of like a dog that's chewing its own tail, that we're giving the machines the information, the systems the information, and then they're giving it back to us. But then how do you break out from that and continue along the path of human evolution in terms of enlightenment and talking also about inner development? How do we continue growth?
I think we're always growing. We're always in evolution anyway. And so for me, I look at this as if someone's designing it as just merely as a tool, that's okay as well, right? We've had so many tools. Humanity, we're obsessed with tools. Right? We're always thinking of the next tool. And so it's okay to continue on that quest of the next better tool for something else. But I think the bigger question is, are AI systems going to actually enable us to have a moment of pause and start to question our own reality? I'm planting seeds, Tamsin. I'm trying to create the landscape where this conversation can happen, so that even if this designer has never thought of it that way, now they have an opportunity to have a think about it. Right? So it's more like seeding these ideas that there's more than one way of solving a problem. I'm not convinced that it's a general purpose tool, although that's how it's being promoted. There is something else about us that has the potential to discover more worlds and more ideas. And so for me, that's the bit that I'm trying to create this space for, talking about this other potential of being more than human with all our more than human friends. There's so much more about us. And I just want to seed that idea that there's another way that our ancestors used to sit with and think about.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I believe that there are some incredibly good uses for artificial intelligence, and that it can help with agriculture, it can help with medicine, and that there are some really good uses for it. But I think that there is a fear also when you hear about potential job losses and so on. There's a fear that it will also be used to the detriment of the further development of humanity. I wonder if you have some examples of either things that you would like to see happen through AI or things that you have already seen happen that kind of go in the direction that you are working towards.
So one of the things that and I hear you, I hold reservations around AI use, but I also steer away from the dystopian and utopian narrative. I think that's not helpful because the thing is already here, right? And one way or another, it was going to be invented, or it's not new, actually. It's been an ongoing discussion since Alan Turing, since the end of World War II. So we've had discussions about AI. It's just become popular or public, right? So now everyone can talk about artificial intelligence. But the way that I look at it is, I say it has a kaleidoscopic effect. It's more of the same, right? If you've ever played with a kaleidoscope, after a while, you're done. It's producing beautiful shapes at the end. That's nice, but it's the same shards inside. So this is a moment for us to step outside of that kaleidoscopic world that we live in and actually start to look at each other as human beings and start to wonder about things that we didn't wonder about. I think that what I would love to see with artificial intelligence is that it becomes smaller and very specialized. Because I'm in very many spaces with a lot of people who are discussing AI from a very high level perspective, I think that the hype will die, and then we will end up with what is this technology good for? And then curate smaller models that, again, help us with solutions that are highly technical, whether that's in hospitals or in agriculture, like you said. And that's already happening across Africa. So there is this interesting pessimism that is emerging out of the West around AI and a very optimistic look at artificial intelligence in the developing parts of the world that have not had the technology that can help transcend some of these developmental issues. At the same time, artificial intelligence as it is right now, I don't know if that changes in the future, it is power hungry. It is an environmental hazard. So to answer your question, what I would like to see is small models that are highly sustainable, that are highly technical, and are used just for a certain amount of tasks. And then we can start to look at ourselves. Well, how do we actually spend all our time all day long? What is this thing called work that we do? We can all become philosophers of life by recovering our time that we spent doing a lot of work that was unnecessary. So for me, that's the hopeful side of technology. And at the same time, I'm very cautious about how it ends up being deployed.
Okay. Well, have you already seen examples of where it's in use to support the work of NGOs, maybe even with the Ubuntu frame of reference at play?
So there are a lot of different organizations already. I mean, like for sure, within the humanitarian world, AI is going to become very useful. My husband runs an organization called Humanity Link, which uses chatbots to help have conversations with people in need directly and directly reach them, right? So that's an AI-generated system, right? So that will create a lot of efficiency in places where that was not possible. If you're talking about somebody who's stuck in the middle of the desert, but they've got a cell phone and they can be reached via a chatbot that has language translation. I mean, how amazing is that to be able to reach someone directly? That's incredible. So for me, those are really amazing ways of solving problems of modernity. But we must not forget that we created that world. So maybe AI is a temporary tool to clean up the mess that we have created as humanity before we can step into the real work of inner development, of relating, which is what Ubuntu would teach us. So if we can develop these technologies from a place of Ubuntu and realizing that we want to solve particular problems that have removed us so far away from our being, so that when we solve those humanitarian crises or agricultural problems or the hospital conditions, which we can solve, like, for example, in Kenya, there are organizations that are working to refine the data, the medical records that have always been held in government offices and not very well recorded. And this is very helpful for doctors. Doctors who are working in rural parts of the country are able to now directly get a hold of a patient's records and be able to help them remotely even. I mean, that's significant for me. That's why I'm saying there's this optimism in parts of the world where I am from, where we see the potential for AI to actually clean up the mess and help us live a better, cleaner life. So we can actually go back to the thing that we've always been very good at, which is relating, which is being human together.
Now, that's a really nice example that you give there, also just creating accessibility where it doesn't currently exist, which also creates time, right?
I think that's the main thing that we're going to ask ourselves. What are we going to do with all the time that we will have once we have the time to sit and think about who we really are. And that's where the point of Ubuntu comes in. I would like to plant these seeds of Ubuntu so that when that time comes, when we're all sitting down in our little corner of the world and trying to discover what it means to be human, we at least have a language for it. And we have a method, a way of being, a way of relating. We're now talking about relational intelligence. Can AI help us expand that field of relational intelligence? I don't know if it can. All I know is that we do need to recover our time, the time that it takes to be human together. Right now, we're so distracted. We're busy trying to solve problems of modernity. And what does it mean to be human sounds like a very privileged question to sit around and talk about.
Mm. But when you talk to designers about this kind of thing, do you find that they're receptive, that they're listening not only to how they might design their systems, but also that they're thinking further ahead to a time when human beings might have enough space to actually come together? Because as you're speaking, I'm thinking, well, it sounds great, but then I'm kind of just going through my mind, like, how's that going to work? And lots of questions. And I just wonder if you're in a design setting, if there is reception.
The interesting thing is that in the utopian camp, there's a lot of optimism around the idea of AI taking over the jobs that we don't like to do anyway, and then giving us more freedom to have time. So that's the space where this conversation becomes very interesting. And that is resonant with the people that are designing with that future in mind. Now, the kinds of people who are designing for a dystopian, I haven't really actually met people that are designing for a dystopian future, to be honest. But there's a lot of discussions out there, you see it all the time. I think there's a lot of misinformation as well. In reality, I have faith in our ability to be human together. I genuinely believe that nobody goes into, and again, this is maybe perhaps naive thinking, but I believe that anything we can imagine, we can become. And so if we start to imagine ourselves as being better at relating, even at the point of design, if that's the thought that's driving your design thinking, then you're going to come up with a feature that will optimize for relating. And so that's my hope. Again, planting seeds and hoping that they grow around the world.
Yeah, that's really nice. And I got two other questions. One is, when we think about inner development, do you have any examples of where there is an intersection between AI and inner development?
Yeah, so I was part of a group that was tasked with building or curating a very dedicated AI system that's dedicated to promoting compassion, acts of kindness, very much based on inner development. It's called Awaken AI. And that is very much at the intersection of indigenous ways of being and thinking, the spirituality, and then how that helps us grow our own inner worlds. And I even have a bot there called the Wakanyi bot. And what we've done is the data that's been used to create this AI system is very dedicated. It's very highly curated. So you'll find spiritual teachings from certain spiritual teachers. You'll find indigenous knowledge from certain wisdom keepers. And I have added some of my stories, some of my folk tales to sort of promote Ubuntu in that space. And so what is interesting is the prompts, the quality of the prompts. I think this is something that we don't really talk about, but how we prompt AI also gives us the opportunity to receive a particular response. So prompt engineering, I believe, is going to be the way that we really use these technologies in the right way to encourage us to ask the right questions, to discover more about what it is that we need to know about ourselves in order to relate better. So there is that little potential there, but it comes down to the data that's been used to train the models. So Awaken AI is an example of one of those models that is really dedicated to helping people curate or prompt AI better and be able to have a response that's actually coming from a place of inner development.
All right. The final question, and this is one that everybody has been asked, if there's one quality that you think everyone in the world would benefit from having right about now, what do you think that would be?
I would say the quality of experiencing a very sacred, ordinary life. I don't know if that's a quality in itself, but the quality of curiously experiencing the ordinary life. I think what we stand to lose is the idea of being an ordinary human being. There's been so much focus on being this way and achievements and fighting for this and that. But when we have that dedicated time to sit with ourselves, all of a sudden, you can have a relationship with a little bug that's on the ground, You can have a relationship with the trees or the leaves in your garden. So for me, that is the quality of being human. That's what's going to expand our awareness of who we are when we start to relate with something else other than just this human experience. That to me is what I hope we promote.
That's lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to learn more about Wakanyi's work, be sure to check out the show notes. And if you want to hear more inspiring stories from the field of sustainability and inner development, there are plenty of past episodes to listen to. And as always, if this conversation captured your imagination, please do share it and subscribe to the podcast. We'll be taking a short break, but hope to be back with a new season of the Inner Green Deal podcast soon. For now, though, thanks for listening and goodbye.